Welcome. We're about to start. But before we do, please be aware of the exit signs in case we need to leave the room for any reason. Also, for those that are online on the internet, we strongly encourage folks for the Q&A to send in your emails at first opportunity so we could have that time so we can deal with your question. So with that, Lee.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome to the seminar. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Frank Mitloehner. Dr. Mitloehner is a professor of the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis. He is a nationally and internationally recognized expert on air emissions from livestock production. Professor Mitloehner has served as the chairman of a United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization partnership project to benchmark the environmental footprint of livestock production as a work group member on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology and a member on the National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine Committee. Professor Mitloehner received his MS degree in Animal Science and Agricultural Engineering from the University of Leipzig in Germany and his PhD degree in Animal Science from Texas Tech University. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Mitloehner.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lei. It's a great pleasure to be here at the conclusion of this research on silage emissions. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the Air Resources Board as the sponsor of this research. And there are many individuals I have to thank. Dongmin Luo, Lei Guo, Kevin Esslinger, others have helped me shepherd along this project, and I'm very thankful to that. I can tell you we've been on a real journey in the understanding of volatile organic compounds from dairies. If I compare where we are today with where we were 12, 13, 14 years ago, I would say we have shifted our knowledge tremendously, and we have advanced very much so. I would say 12 years ago, everybody was completely focusing on dairy manure, particularly liquid dairy manure in lagoons, as the main source of VOCs. And I think over time we have found that there are other significant sources, and one of them we discussed today, which is silage. We actually ran into this topic almost by coincidence. At the time, Irina Markina, who's also here in the room, worked in my lab, and we looked at various sources of VOC emissions on a dairy. We looked at fresh waste, at stored waste, at animals themselves, enteric emissions. We looked at various feed sources, and our gas analyzers just went crazy when we looked at fermented feed. And at first we thought there was something wrong with the analyzers because the signals were so high. But we soon found out that fermented feed was really a much stronger signal to VOCs, to many of the VOCs we were interested in, and a greater contributor overall. And so that was the start of a long line of research we did that has culminated in in 10 peer-reviewed publications that are now available in the scientific literature on silage per se. So the topic of our seminar is the impacts and mitigation of dairy feed on air quality. I want to acknowledge my co-workers. A graduate student in my lab, Matt Cohen, was mainly involved. That was his master's work. Dr. Yangling Yu Yongying Zhao and Yui Pan were the major staff members on my team. Dr. Al Rotz from USDA ARS was my partner on the modeling side, and his co-workers are listed here on this title slide. Yes. So I don't need to tell you that we have some significant air quality challenges in the state. We probably have some of the most significant ones in the nation, and this slide here is a slide I love to show, particularly to audiences outside of California, because it shows so nicely how topography contributes to one of our challenges, which is trapping air pollution in an airshed for prolonged periods of time. And you can see very well here how air pollution is trapped in the Great Central Valley here, and this white depiction here is just that air pollution, whether it's smoke or particles or a mixture of everything. So what makes this region really unique is that the Great Central Valley is the #1 agricultural area in the United States, mainly, maybe in the world. And in this area here, between Sacramento, where we are right now, and Bakersfield, the so-called San Joaquin Valley, we house 20% of the US dairy herd. There's no other place in the United States that has more cows than this region. And when you are in a place like Tulare or Fresno, you look out of a window, you will see cows. Cows are just everywhere. A county like Fresno has more dairy cows than the whole of Colorado. A county like Tulare has more cows than the whole of Pennsylvania. So we're talking about high concentration of livestock, and needless to say, wherever you have large concentration of a certain sector and wherever you have environmental challenges, people like to look at associations. And so today I talk about a portion of that association, namely the feed of dairies. So when it comes to VOC sources on dairies, well, there are numerous potential sources. The manure in the housing facility is one. Then sooner or later it's flushed or scraped from the animal housing, from the freestall barns, or from the dry lot corrals into the manure storage. Sooner or later that manure is then land applied to crops as fertilizer. And then in addition to these manure-related sources, there is the so-called silage. And the silage has various parts of a life cycle that I will talk about. And last not least, sooner or later you take the silage off the pile and you put it into a mixture that's fed to cows, and that's called a total mixed ration. And that's then fed to cows, ingested by the animals, and then of course eventually the nutrients are excreted and then it goes back into the manure stream. So originally, as I said initially, the focus of the VOC discussion was clearly on stored manure. That's where everybody thought the main contributions were. Today, we believe that approximately 90% of the VOC emissions on a dairy are associated with the feed before the animals ingest it. And that is a sea change compared to where we were 10, 15 years ago in our understanding of that sector as a source contributor of VOCs. What has also changed tremendously is our understanding in what kind of VOCs are associated with dairies, and in particular, what kind of VOCs are associated with feedstuff. By far the most important group of VOCs on dairies are alcohols, and here #1 being ethanol. And you can see here, this slide shows different alcohols, different aldehydes, different acids. On the y-axis, you see the concentration of these VOCs. And please keep in mind, these are orders of magnitude. So if you look at ethanol here, you might think it doesn't deviate too much from the second or third most abundant compound, but these are orders of magnitude that they differ. So ethanol is a very important compound. And of course, we are interested in what the speciation of the VOC mix is because they are not created equal and they have a different potency. They have a different reactivity, meaning a different potency to produce smog, or ozone first and then eventually smog. And so ethanol is not very reactive, but because it's so abundant, it is a major interest. What we find also occurring at high enough numbers to be interested in are aldehydes, and of course many of those are more reactive than many of the alcohols. And then we find also acids, such as volatile such as acetic acid, propionic acid, butyric acid, and others. I will now walk you through, first of all, what silage is, okay? Because many people think silage is just the cob of corn or so that's made into some miraculous feed, but it's not. Silage is pretty much the entire plant chopped into small pieces. For example, corn silage consists of the entire plant, let's say a 10-foot corn plant, that's chopped into small pieces, and then these small pieces are put on a mound. Okay, first that mound might be as high as I'm showing you right now. Then a heavy tractor is used to get all the air out of that. All the pores in between the silage particles need to be closed, and air needs to be pushed out. Why? Because silage is a completely anaerobic process. We do not want oxygen in the silage. Oxygen is the enemy. Once you get oxygen into silage, this material will go bad. So after you have the first layer of silage compacted, a vehicle will come and dump more silage material on top, and then the tractor will compact the second layer and the third layer and the fourth layer and so on, until the silage pile is built and compacted completely. And once that's done, the silage pile needs to be covered with plastic. Again, to shield it from outside introduction of oxygen. And last not least, that plastic that's now covering the silage pile needs to be weighed down, and that's generally done with tires, with rubber tires. So when you drive by dairies, you see these white piles with tires on top. These are silage piles. Silage can be made from various plants. Most often you might see corn silage, but there's alfalfa silage, there are cereal silages, there are many different plant materials that you can make into silage. Why do people make silage? They make silage because it's one way of preserving that feedstuff for many months to be used. How does that work? So once the silage pile is covered and once the oxygen is taken out, then lactic acid forming microbes will just multiply tremendously inside. They will take over the microbial community inside that pile, and they will become the most important, the most abundant species in there. And these lactic acid forming microbes will do what? They will form lactic acid. That lactic acid will then drop the pH in the silage from neutral, 7, 7.5, down to 4. And once that pH is down to 4, then all the other microbes give up. And that material is preserved for many, many months to be used. So you basically have produced sauerkraut. And who likes sauerkraut? Other than Germans, of course. So you do have a drop in pH. This drop in pH makes the life of the remaining microbes pretty much miserable. Therefore, those that spoil silage are inhibited and or outnumbered. And therefore, you have a product that you can use for many, many months to go. Silage is the most important feedstuff on a dairy. Approximately half of a cow's diet is silage. The silage, whether it's corn silage or alfalfa silage or a mixture of these two and others, is mixed with so-called concentrates such as corn or cottonseed, all different kinds of ingredients, and formed and put into what's called a TMR. So when you hear me talk about a TMR, that's referring to a total mixed ration. So you take the silage plus other ingredients, you mix it all together, and then you put it in front of the cows as a TMR, a total mixed ration. This total mixed ration is generally mixed in a feed mixer wagon. I have to give you this 101 because I know some of you are not familiar with the terminology. It's mixed in a feed mixer wagon, and then this feed mixer wagon drives through the barn where the cows are, along the feed lanes where the cows eat and drops the feed, the total mixed ration feed, in front of the cows. Some dairies feed once a day, some dairies feed twice a day, some dairies feed 3 times a day. So there's no, there are different feeding strategies. And then whenever the cows feel like eating, they can go to the feed lane and eat. So the life cycle of silage is one issue that is very important and that I will harp upon during this presentation because it's so important to understand. Because people ask me, how shall I store my silage? Or how shall I deface it? Or shall I use silage additives to assist with the fermentation inside the pile? The answer is not simple at all, because if you do very well in one phase of the life cycle of silage and you don't do very well in another phase, then all the gains you make here, you might lose over here. So you have many unintended consequences if you do not understand the life cycle of that feed material. That's very critical and very important for me to emphasize. So what you see here, some of these slides are from 2 of the UC Cooperative Extension farm advisors, Noelia Del Rio, former advisor, and Jennifer Hagee. What you see on this slide here on the right side is recently chopped material. So that was chopped cut by a custom chopper, chopped material that's put on the mound, and then the heavy tractor drives on top to compact that material, to get all the air out. The second that they are done building the mound, building this silage pile, a crew will come in and cover it with plastic. And that's what I referred to before. And then that plastic is weighed down with tires. So that's the initial phase of ensiling. What's important here is that even though the custom chopper tries to get rid of all the oxygen, some oxygen will still be inside. And as a result, many of the microbes in that pile at this stage are still aerobic microbes. They will consume freely available sugars and so on, and they will produce CO2 at this stage, CO2, and they will also produce NOx. And that's one of the topics I will talk about. This phase here is a phase that takes about a few days, okay? But during that phase, a lot of CO2 is produced and also NOx is produced. Then all of the sugars are eaten up by those aerobic microbes. Soon they'll be gone, and lactic acid forming microbes take over. The pH drops, and then a couple of processes will occur that I will show you in a minute. How do you store silage? There are different ways to storing silage, and here you see 3. Here you see a silage pile, and that's what you typically see when you drive through the valley. A silage pile. They are different in size. Some of them are about the size of this room here. Others can be much larger. Then there are so-called silage bags. These are long sausage-like bags. Just imagine a giant sausage. So they are long, but the surface is relatively small. So the surface could be, let's say, the face of it could be the size of the screen here. And then there are the so-called bunkers. And bunkers are called that way. They have concrete sidewalls, such as this one here, concrete sidewalls. And the reason why bunkers are used is so that when a tractor drives on top of the silage pile, that silage doesn't go to the sides and that the compaction can be done in a better way. That's at least what people think happens there. So in California, we mainly have the conventional pile here on top. We also see ag bags, silage bags, such as these ones depicted here in the bottom left. We don't see very many bunkers here. We don't see very many bunker silos. This here is a very typical silage phase. When I say silage phase, I mean the front of the silage pile from where the feed is taken off every day, a process we call defacing. And here you see a typical corn silage phase. So you can see a few people standing there. By the way, I don't recommend you do that because silage piles do have the tendency to avalanche. Okay? So silage material can break off and bury people underneath. So do not do what these people do here. But this is nice to see a size comparison of a person versus the face of such a pile. Now, many of these conventional silage piles, and that's what I will call them throughout this presentation, are so large that the dairy only needs half of its face to be fed to the cows every day. And when I say half, I mean they go a foot or so depth, and they take this half of the face area off per day. The next day, then they will take over the next side, the second half of this pile. So these faces are large, can be large. And a typical way of defacing is to take a relatively small depth off that face. That's different compared to the egg bag, which is long, which is this long one, where you have a smaller face and where you need to go to a greater depth in order to get enough feed for your cows. It's a different way of defacing. So I know this is a very wordy slide, but this is an important slide for me to walk you through step by step. So I urge you not to just start reading and not listening, because this is important to go through step by step. So there are VOCs and NOx gases that are emitted from silage piles in different phases. And I will walk you through these phases. But what are they? The first one is the one I just talked about, the aerobic phase, when chopped material is put down, compacted, then covered the first few days, 4 or 5 days. That's the aerobic phase. Then comes the fermentation phase, where lactic acid forming microbes will start producing lactic acid and where fermentation occurs. Then comes the storage phase. The storage phase can take many months. You can store silage for a long time, 8 months, 9 months, a year. Some silage has been found to be stored and be still okay after many years. But most dairymen, of course, don't store silage for many years, but for numerous months. Then comes, so the storage phase is basically the phase when the pile is still totally enclosed. Nobody has opened it yet. Then comes the time when the silage is used from that pile, and that's called the feed-out phase. So that's when the material, the silage material, is extracted or defaced from the face of the pile and put into the total mixed ration of the cows. The mixing phase is what I just described, when you take the silage and you mix it with other feed stuff in the mixer wagon. And last not least, the last phase is the phase when the material that used to be in the pile is now in front of the cows. And that's called the feeding phase. That's the phase when the material is in front of the cows. Yeah? Any questions on this? This here is a depiction that's also very important. What this shows is, on the left side, so the first phase here, phase 1, that's really the first day of ensiling. On the bottom axis here, on the x-axis, you see the days. Day 2, day 3, day 4, and so on. So at the beginning, you have cell respiration, you have production of CO2, but you also have the production of NOx right here during phase 1, during phase 2, and partly also during phase 3. That's when NO and NO2 are produced and when CO2 is produced. What happens during this phase is the following. After the microbial activity in that pile is such that the temperature of the pile increases. And you can see this here in phase 1 leading into phase 2. The temperature inside the pile increases from approximately 70 degrees Fahrenheit to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That increase in temperature has everything to do with microbial activity. Because a lot of that microbial activity is caused by lactic acid forming microbes, and they produce lactic acid, the pH changes from neutral down to 4, and that's what you see in the graph depicted right here. So the pH drops, and once the pH is down at 4 or so, you will stop producing NOx, you will largely stop producing most of the other gases, and the pile is pretty stable. Anaerobic at that time, okay? Anaerobic at that time. So if you look at the phase 3, you see that the pH is very stable at 4, and it stays stable all the way throughout phase 4. So phase 3 and phase 4 can take multiple months. Not much happens during that time with respect to pH, with respect to temperature, and so on. But then something happens, and that's in phase 5. Imagine you have a totally anaerobic pile covered on all sides, and now you open it. So what happens at this point? You expose it to oxygen. And that means that now you have good conditions for aerobic microbes again, and these aerobic microbes will multiply in large numbers. And these are things we don't really want to have in silage, but it is unavoidable. These are things like aerobic bacteria, yeasts, and molds. The second you open that pile, you have an increase in those microbes that actually can lead to spoiling of the silage material. That's the reason why we don't want silage to be exposed to oxygen for a long time. That's why it's a must to cover silage. I mean, there are a few dairies that don't cover silage, and I've seen one recently, and I cannot get my mind around why anybody would do that. It makes no sense. It's an anaerobic process. It should be kept that way for the longest time possible. So the greatest emission issues that we have occur at the front end of ensiling in phases 1 and 2, and at the back end of ensiling phases 5 and beyond in the feed-out phase and in the feeding phase. So at the beginning here in phase 1 and 2, there's some production of NOx. Not so much production of VOCs, but production of NOx in phases 1 and 2. In phase 3, production of NOx is low. In phase 4, it's low. In phase 5, it's low as well. But it is measurable. But phase 5 is where VOCs become more important, but not most important. Most important is another phase that I will talk about in a few minutes. Does this depiction make sense? Does anybody have questions? Okay. This slide here shows corn silage dry matter losses. Dry matter losses refers to, imagine you have 100% mass and as dry matter, and now you have losses of that. Let's say if you have 20% losses of that dry matter, of that pile, then that means 20% of that feed material is now no longer there. And it's not moisture that's going off, it's dry matter going off. Okay? It's actually feed disappearing. And what has been known for a long time is that there are different processes in ensiling that lead to dry matter losses. So this is losses to the pocketbook of the dairyman. Okay? So no dairy wants to have high dry matter losses, but dry matter losses have been reported to be relatively low in very good dairies, 8 to 10%, but they can go high too. Some dairies that don't manage as well might get up to high numbers of dry matter losses. Now, nobody wants to go there and be there, but it happens that dry matter losses occur. And here are the percent ranges as to where dry matter losses occur. And you can see here some dry matter is lost at the beginning of ensiling, some is lost due to the work of microorganisms, and so on. And you see here the density of the ensiling has a relatively large potential contribution to dry matter losses. The sealing of your piles does, and the feed-out management, so how you feed out the silage. So there is a range, as you can see here, from relatively low 8% to incredibly high 40%, and thank God that's very rare. That would happen, a 40% loss would occur if you would not cover your silage. If you just leave the pile uncovered. And again, there are very few people who do that. What this slide shows is what happens in the first few days of ensiling, and that's actually not so much an air quality issue with respect to major ozone formation in the valley or so, as it is an exposure risk. The first 5 days or so are the time when NO and NO2 are produced, NOx. And what you see here are the first 5 hours after ensiling starts. So this, the light in this room is not conducive to show this well, But what you would see under normal condition is a light yellow here, a darker yellow here, and a pretty brown over here. And this is the formation of NOx within 5 hours. So within the first few hours, the first few days of ensiling, significant amounts of NOx are formed. But this is, as I said, more of an exposure risk to people who might work at the pile or people like scientists who want to measure it. It's not so much an issue with respect to overall air quality in the valley. This gas that occurs the first 5 hours, NO and NO2, are also referred to as silage gas. This has actually been known for a long, long time. People have reported on accidents in enclosed spaces around silage for over 100 years. So there's nothing new there. What is new is that NOx, of course, also is important when you think about ozone formation. And so we wanted to know how much of that can be formed. However, we ran into issues ourselves with respect to exposure of NOx, and so we have relatively little data compared to the data we have on VOCs. Relatively little data on NOx, simply because it was very hard to protect my people in the field from exposure to this gas. So once you open this phase, at the time that you start feeding the silage, once you open the phase, you will see, and this is a heat camera, that the phase heats up. And this heating up here is a process that's elicited by aerobic microbes. So the second you open that anaerobic pile and aerobic microbes get into it, and such as molds and yeasts and so on, this phase will become hot. It will become hot. And that's a sign of aerobic deterioration. So that happens at the end of the ensiling process. This slide here is an important one. It shows on the left side 3 silage particles. Imagine 3 pieces of, let's say, the corn plant here. We call them silage particles, 1, 2, 3. And on the right side you see also 3 particles, the yellow ones. And then inside these 3 particles and around them you see these molecules, and these molecules here are ethanol. So what this slide shows is, on the right side, 3 silage particles that are well compacted. So a tractor driving over the silage pile often, and heavy enough tractors, will compact the silage so that little air is around the particles. And that means that the ethanol and other VOCs that are actually nutrients that we want to get into the cows, that they stay inside the silage particle. However, if compaction is not sufficient, such as on this side, then if it's not sufficient, then these molecules, whether it's ethanol or other VOCs, will go from the solid phase into the gas phase. They will go into the gas phase. In the case of ethanol, the vast majority of these molecules will leave the particle within 12 hours. So if you have a feed particle lying around in the open and it's exposed to oxygen, then it takes about up to 12 hours for that molecule to leave the silage and go into the air. And so that's of course what we try to prevent, and therefore one of the things that we have looked at is how important is packing of the silage. How important is the way we deface the silage pile? How important is it how we store the silage? How important is the way we feed it to the cows? And that's what I'm about to lead you through. So compaction is important because we want our VOCs to stay in the feed and make it in the cows because these are nutrients that we don't want to lose. If we lose them, we have environmental impact, and we have also an impact on the dairyman's finances because these are nutrients lost to milk production. The objectives of our study here were to measure emissions of VOCs from various defacing methods, meaning different ways of getting the silage off the pile, measure different storage types, so the long egg bag versus the normal conventional pile and so on, then to look at the actual feed that we put in front of the cows that we either enrich with some water or more water or no water, And the reason for this is that VOCs like to stay, they prefer to stay in the liquid phase compared to the gas phase. So if we add a certain amount of water to the feed, then the hypothesis was that the VOCs will stay in the liquid phase, in the water, and then make it into the cows, as opposed to getting into the air. So we looked at adding some water to the feed to keep the VOCs in the feed and get them in the cows. And then, last not least, we also looked at a VOC emission model that we completed, and that will, I think, be very informative in the process. One objective that I have not listed here, but that we have investigated, was a comparison of different microbial and chemical additives during the silage making process. So many companies are out there and they sell silage additives, claiming if you put in our silage additive, our microbial additive, for example, then you will have less dry matter losses, or then you will have better milk production, or you will have, you name it. You know, many, many claims are associated with that. The question we had was whether or not these different silage additives have any beneficial impact on VOC emissions or other emissions. And so we tested the different microbial additives that are out there, homofermentative, heterofermentative, and also chemical additives. But to our surprise, those additives did not do what was promised. The vast majority of microbial additives did not reduce VOCs, but they increased VOCs. And in some cases, they increased them by fourfold. The chemical additive that we measured actually did decrease certain VOCs. But I would not recommend an air body, an air regulatory agency, to mandate the use of additives and or even suggest it, because we did not see, of course, our research is not the end all to researching it, but we have no indication that they will have a beneficial effect. So, but anyhow, that's published in the peer-reviewed literature, and I will show you the reference at the end so that you can look it up if you're interested in it. So I will now walk you through the actual emission monitoring. I will first show you some photos to give you an idea of what this research looked like. So we had a lot of monitoring equipment that was housed in a mobile air quality lab. This mobile air quality lab was brought out to the dairies and contained this list of gas analyzers. We measured the surface emissions of piles, either using flux chambers or wind tunnels, not either or, both. We used both. And you will see some photos in a minute. So this here is a silage pile, and this is the face of the silage pile. And very quickly, we became very familiar with the potential safety risks of doing research in such an environment, simply because of one issue, which is avalanching, of collapsing silage faces onto people. So we had to protect against that. And secondly, we had to make sure that nobody gets exposed to the initial silage gas. In order to protect my people from avalanching faces, we actually used this container here, this shipping container, which had a roll-up door on the one side. And this roll-up door was opened and then put flush against the silage face, and it had a man door on the side. And the people on our team who worked on the faces were, while they did this, covered entirely. And right after we started our first measurement, we had about 300 pounds of silage raining down onto the roof of this thing. So I tell you, I was very, very pleased for having done this investment. It happens, and it's nothing unusual, and it's known to people, but who are we as some researchers? Normally you are pretty much oblivious to these things. But inside the trailer here, you see this trailer again on the left side. Inside the trailer, the flux chamber and the wind tunnel and all the equipment attached to it were located. The different devices were put flush against the faces of the silage piles, and then gases were measured. There were different defacing methods used. Different defacing methods. Imagine this wall there being the face of a silage pile. If I were to go toward that face with a front end loader and go straight into the face and rip it off, then that's what we call perpendicular defacing, perpendicular defacing. If you were to drive with the same front-end loader sidewise, then that's called lateral defacing. It's a different way, it's a smoother cut of the silage off the pile. And then there are also other methods. In the Midwest, they use hydraulic defacers. These are rotating devices, similar to what the gentleman in this room used to shave in the morning. They give a very clean shave, but in California, they are largely not used. I believe there's only one in use right now. It's at least, and so we didn't use that. But we did use another one called an easy rake, which is a rake that basically rakes off the face of the pile. So the first one here was, the first one was perpendicular defacing. The second one here, that's lateral defacing. So you see here on the right side, the face of that pile is pretty clear cut. And this is the third way of defacing using a rake, as I said before. People think that might be a nice smooth way of defacing, but if you really look closely, you will see these grooves there. So what's an advantage of this clearly is the very long arm of this rake. The very long arm of the rake, and that means it protects the operator and the equipment from anything falling down. And then another treatment, as I indicated before, was to take the TMR and include water in it. 5% water or 10% water, and compare that to the unadded, the non-added TMR. And last not least, this is the so-called feed lane. This is where the feed is placed in front of the cows. So you see here the cows ready to eat, and the feed lane is basically it's not a bunk, it's basically just the lane, flat lane, and the feed is poured out in front of them. The cows stoop their heads into it and take the feed off. And after a while, there's actually feed that's pushed away from the cows, and so 2-3 times a day, a special vehicle comes and pushes the feed back toward the cows, so that the cows never run out of feed. So again, this is called the feed lane, the feed lane. So now talking about results, of course, I concentrate on several of the more important results. The first one here is ethanol emissions from different silage defacing methods. So you see here on the x-axis the 3 treatments, the easy rake, so that's the long rake, then the lateral defacing and the perpendicular defacing on the right. And on the y-axis you see total amount of ethanol coming off those faces. And we would have thought that there might be more differences between the raked versus the perpendicular defacing, but they look very much the same. The lateral seem to be a little lower. So driving by the face in a lateral way compared to perpendicular gave you a smoother surface, and smoother surface means what? Less oxygen, and it also means less emission source, right? There's a smaller area from where emissions can go off. So the smoother the face in general, the less exposure to oxygen and the less area from where stuff can volatilize into the air. This slide here shows 2 of the silage storage forms. On the left you see the silage bag, on the right the conventional silage pile. And this is ethanol on the y-axis here. And so what you see is that the silage bag, these long bags, compared to the large piles, that the long bags have a smaller amount of ethanol, and that was our number 1 VOC coming off. And so you might think as a take-home message, hey, how about we just do egg bags everywhere, or silage bags everywhere? And if we had just looked into this as a main study, we would have come to conclusions that would have been detrimental to many, many different stakeholders. So if you just look at this portion of the picture, then it would lead you to believe the one solution here is to change the storage of the silage pile from standard into the long silage bags. But keep your horses, or hold your horses, because I think it will all fall into place in a minute. Actually, I'm going back here to the raked, the perpendicular, and the lateral defacing on the, so that's raked is up here, the top one, perpendicular is the green, lateral is the red, and that's contrasted to the normal defacing of an egg bag. And so again, if you compare those, then you might come to the conclusion that the silage bag or egg bag, whatever you want to call it, has the lower emissions. This, in this case, is methanol. This is ethanol. So here, your conclusions might then be different. While on the methanol side, you would say the egg bag is the best. On the ethanol side, you would say it's not, because now the egg bag is relatively higher in emissions. So always look for unintended consequences. This slide here shows ammonia emissions. Now this is ammonia emissions in milligrams, so that's very low, milligrams per hour per square meter. And you see, yeah, there is some ammonia, but it's very little. Again, this is not grams per hour per square meter, this is milligrams. So I just wanted to show we have measured it, it was there, but it was there in small amounts. So we can really forget about ammonia. It's not anything important from silages. This is N2O from silage storage methods. It's the reason why many of the treatments don't show up is because they didn't show up. They weren't there. But the egg bag actually did show some N2O, some nitrous oxide. And so whenever we opened that bag, so the egg bag, this long sausage-like storage form, is oftentimes covered at night. So a little bit of a piece of plastic is kept and folded to shut the face at night. When you open that face in the morning, then you will have some N2O, nitrous oxide, come out. And you see it here. The other faces did not have any major N2O coming off it. Now we look at the different water inclusion rates of the total mixed ration. So that's the material that you are about to put in front of the cows. And it shows here, first of all, the raw silage, which is the orange. Where am I? Sorry. The total mixed ration without any water added is the orange, here the top line. And the one with 5% water added is the blue line that's covered by the TMR with 10% water added. Then you see in red, this red line here, this one, that's raw silage, so that's not TMR. So if you look at TMR with 0 water here on top, this one, versus 5 or 10% water added, then at the beginning, the first 5, 6, 7 hours, so right over here, you would say that adding water will reduce ethanol for a given amount of time, 5, 6, 7 hours or so. So in fact, even though this picture doesn't depict it very well, but if you really do the math and you look at how much of a reduction that would be, it's about a third or so reduction. So that can make a difference. Will adding water do anything to feeding cows? Not at these rates. Adding 5% water to a TMR or 10% water to a TMR will not do anything to cow feeding. In fact, most dairies do that already because it improves palatability. Palatability being basically the cow's willingness to eat. So this here is methanol. The raw silage has much higher methanol, and that's the top line compared to the other three, which are depicted down here. The TMR with 0 water is again the one with the relatively higher emissions compared to those with water inclusion. I think now comes something that you'll find interesting. So the emission data were mainly were majorly important in order to allow us to do a major modeling exercise. We wanted to have an understanding of the pros and cons, the trade-offs of what happens if I make changes to one stage of ensiling. What happens to the other stages? Is there anything in particular that pops out that we really need to focus on? The modeling actually allowed us to do that. My colleague Al Rotz from USDA ARS took the lead on this. And what I'm about to show you here is the major results. So we developed what's called a process-based model, and we looked at the life cycle of the ensiling process. We integrated our silage model into what's called the whole farm systems model, and that's IFSM. IFSM has been published, I don't know how many dozen times in the peer-reviewed literature. What's really new here is that we now have a silage component of IFSM, and that is very new. We were able, because of our monitoring efforts, to validate the model algorithms and make sure that we are doing a good job with the model predictions. So how was the modeling conducted? First of all, when I talk about the life cycle, we looked at the actual storage, so that's phase emissions. We looked at the mixing emissions in the feed mixer wagon, and the feeding emissions, so once the feed is in front of the cows, using a convection diffusion model for storage, first order model, a mixed model for mixing, and a convection diffusion model for feeding. And all of that was then incorporated into this process-based model. So we mainly used ethanol and methanol to validate the model, and the model did a very good job for ethanol. It did not do a very good job for methanol, but a reasonable job for methanol. But ethanol is really the 800-pound gorilla. That's the compound we are most interested in. We then simulated emissions, and we compared the model predictions, of course, to our measured data. So here's an example of how the model compared to the measurements. The storage type here, that's the normal conventional pile. This is the silage bag, and this is the feed lane. So that's all in the left column. Then the defacing method is lateral defacing, perpendicular defacing, the rake defacing. And then you see here in the third column the measured ethanol in kilograms per day, and in the right column the simulated, so the modeled emissions in kilogram per day. And as you can see, for most of these, the modeled emissions versus the monitored emissions were very similar. That was true except for the feed lane where we under-predicted ethanol emissions almost by half. So then we modeled a dairy of 2,000 cows, 2,000 lactating cows with 1,650 replacement animals, 300 hectares of clay loam soil. Corn silage was used as silage material and some small winter grain silage. The cows were housed in freestall barns and also had access to an open lot. All the feed was put into total mixed rations, TMRs, and we used the Sacramento weather, which was very similar to that in, let's say, Fresno or Tulare or so. And we looked at 4 different things. We compared different silo types, such as the normal conventional pile versus bunker versus silage bags. Then we looked at different defacing methods, here called unloading, it's the same as defacing. We looked at the impact of different packing tractors. What happens if you use a light tractor versus a heavy tractor to compact that silage pile? And we looked at what's the impact of an open lot versus a barn, a freestall barn. And here are the results. The first slide here shows on the x-axis a normal standard silage pile versus a bunker and versus silage bags. On the y-axis you see VOC emissions. So what I want to emphasize here is something very important. And that is that each one of these columns has a dark brown and a orangey color. The dark brown color is the contribution of the silage phase. Right here. This dark brown area is the contribution of the silage phase. And this yellow area is the contribution of the silage once it's in the TMR and in front of the cows. So the first column here, for example, shows that of all the silage that was in a standard pile, only a relatively small proportion, that in brown here, is associated with the pile itself, with the face of that pile. A much greater proportion of that silage pile's contribution is during mixing and feeding it to cows. Much bigger, okay, much bigger. So if you look at egg bags or silage bags, you see that the dark brown area is very small here. You can hardly see it. But the emissions that don't go off here from the bag do go off once it's in the mixer and or in the feed lane. Does that make sense to everybody? This is really important. So what this slide basically tells you is that the storage form of the silage is not super important. It is important, as I showed on an earlier monitoring slide. But when you look at the life cycle of that material, then it's more important what happens to the material that was in the pile, what happens to that once it's no longer in the pile but in front of the cows. Because that's this orange area. If this is not clear, I really need to know, because then I explain it better. This slide here shows the impact of packing density. So using a lighted tractor versus heavy tractor or multiple tractors on VOC emissions. And you see again here in brown that the pile, so the emissions from the pile are comparable. The heavy tractor might be a little better with respect to keeping VOCs relatively low. But even though you might keep it low in the pile, once you take it off the pile and in front of the cows, that's when the majority of the emissions occur, and that's this area in yellow or orange. Here, titled mixing and feeding. Defacing, using a bucket, or that's the same as a front-end loader, using a bucket versus using a hydraulic defacer. That gives you a really nice smooth face. The bucket has greater emissions coming of it. There's no doubt about that compared to the defacer. But you can hardly see the difference on this slide because, again, once you take it off the pile and put it in front of the cows, that's where you get the majority of the emissions. Last not least, this slide here shows the open lot, a dry lot corral, let's say, versus a freestall barn, typical for California, versus an enclosed barn, one that you would find in the Midwest, and the emissions. And again, the same picture. You have VOC emissions from the silage phase in these different dairy systems, and they are pretty comparable. But what contributes way more, approximately an order of magnitude more to VOC emissions, more than the pile, is the feed when it's in the feed lanes. And that is a total sea change. Now, if you talk to people in the dairy industry, they will tell you, oh, that makes total sense. And oh yeah, of course, it should be that way. But we know that now because intuitively it makes sense, because these particles, these feed particles, are now fully exposed to air, right? Remember that concept, that conceptual depiction I showed to you with the well-packed silage versus the loosely packed silage? Once that silage material is in the feed lanes, it's very loose. Cows stick their heads in it, they chew it around, they stoop through the material. There are machineries that push the feed back and forth and so on. So meaning these silage particles are now fully exposed to oxygen. And they might stay there for multiple hours. Sometimes dairies feed once a day. And that means the feed is put out in the morning and then pushed back and forth to the cows all day long. So that means everything that's volatilizable in that silage particle can volatilize throughout the daytime. Until it gets into the cow, it's prone to potential volatilization. And the likelihood of VOCs to come off throughout the entire life cycle of silage, the likelihood for those things to come off are the greatest once they are in front of the cow and not on the pile. So we can sit here all we want and talk about what machinery to use to deface, or what way to cover, or whether additives to use and so on. But the one thing that we haven't really considered seriously is how we feed the cows, how we put the feed in front of the cows, how often, what we do with the feed once it's in front of the animals. And so that is a very different status that we are at now compared to where we were a few years ago when we were totally focusing on phase management, where we were focusing on manure and so on. So it has really taken us into a very different direction. So, and that really leads me to my main conclusions. The first one is that there are very distinct phases of silage production, and they are distinctively different from each other with respect to their biological, chemical, physical characteristics. To mitigate emissions from one phase is not likely to be effective. You have to consider the entire life cycle. Gains you make in one phase could be losses in the next phase. You must consider the whole thing. It is very apparent from our research that emissions occur the highest when particles are exposed to air. So exposure to oxygen must be held at a minimum, no matter where within that life cycle. And wherever your interest is, if you are a vendor or so, your focus should be on minimizing exposure of particles to oxygen, because that's when emissions occur. The process-based model was very informative to us, and it validated, first of all, it was validated using our monitoring data, and I think it performed very well. It needs to be improved for other compounds and validated for, the many compounds that are out there. But for ethanol, the 800-pound gorilla, it did a very good job. When simulating a dairy and looking at what the highest contributions would be, it was very clear what they were, and I just shared that with you. To us, it's clear that our earlier efforts on mitigation on the pile were important, but that there are greater benefits to look at the steps that follow the storage of the silage on the pile, and that's the feeding phase. And so that's my last bullet point. I'm leaving you with a list of publications, one of them here, Irina, remember that one? A list of publications that deal with silage emissions. Some of them are really looking into biogeochemical processes, what happens, how do emissions occur from silages, what are the driving factors, what do we have to consider, what's the most important driver. Most important driver for emissions are temperature and velocity, wind velocity. The hotter it is in a given location and the windier it is in a given location, the higher are your losses. And that's the reason why dry matter losses across the United States are the highest in California, because of the weather we have, that's one of the main reasons. So you'll find also some airshed modeling papers and so on. So this is a list of those things that we have published over the last, how many years? Since 2010. And this is the latest one here, the one on additives, on silage additives that I referred to earlier. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and of course, I'm very happy to entertain any questions you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kevin Esslinger, for those who don't know me, and I was Dr. Mettlerner's grad student many years ago, and I've been at ARB for 10 years. I had a couple of questions, but I'll just focus on, I think, the
You make me sound so old.
Yeah, we're all getting up there, right? What was that?
I said, shut the hell up. You're old, I'm ancient.
Hey, I got the greatest show, right? The stress. So I think it would have been interesting to see following the water inclusion throughout the process, through the feeding, and like kind of the best case scenario. Essentially, you have the ag bags with the minimum oxygen exposure, and then I don't know if you didn't have a covered mixing wagon versus an open mixing wagon, but I mean something conceptually like that where you're minimizing oxygen, and then having the 5% water inclusion, and then feeding the ag bag silage to the animals with the 5% water inclusion, to see the kind of the maximum retention of ethanol, because that seems like would be the path to do that, as well as I know you'd originally intended to do the shaver silage equipment, and it's unfortunate that didn't end up happening, but it would have been interesting just to see the comparison.
Well, there are very good reasons as to why some of the things that we hoped we could do weren't done. For example, why didn't we use a hydraulic defacer? Because there is none. I asked dozens of dairymen, and I asked them, do you know anyone? And eventually I found one, but that one was hundreds of miles away, and the dairyman needed it himself. So in reality, I have to do what I can do and what's feasible. And so I could have bought one, but these things cost way more money than the ARB was willing to pay. So, so seriously, I mean, conceptually, yes, it would have been great to have a defacer, a hydraulic defacer. Practically, there was none. Ideally, and hypothetically, we would have loved to have way more data on NOx. Practically, OSHA barred me from. They basically told me, you must not. Or if you do, you put on a whole body suit on, and I don't think any dairyman would appreciate that. So there are certain things that we would like to do and know more about, but we cannot do because of practical reasons that real-world research on real-world facilities don't allow us to. But I totally agree. So I think a next step and an important step to do is to look at those items of information that we have, those mitigation tools that we know have a incremental beneficial effect, and combine them. And we definitely need to know much more about what happens once silage leaves the pile. I mean, so far we had always looked at what happens from the day you make silage until you take it off. But that's not where the focus should be. It should be in the time thereafter, from the time you take it off the pile until it disappears in the cow. That's where we need to go. And who would have known that?
And so you didn't combine the ag bag silage with the water inclusion? You did it completely separate?
Yes, that's separate.
Gotcha.
That's separate. But I would anticipate the results to be very similar. Because these VOCs have such an affinity to water, they will hold on to the molecules, and generally it takes 7, 8, 9 hours for the molecules to be freed from that water.
Exactly.
Except for very hot days when, of course, water evaporates faster.
I think I understand something I'd like to verify with you. It seems to me what you just said is that most of the VOCs are produced during the fermentation and the storage phase. And then after that, it's more the disturbance of the particles that release those VOCs to the atmosphere. And then that's my first part of my question. Second part of my question is I still don't quite understand why the open lot is so much larger than the open barn. Is that just temperature and air circulation?
So first, related to this question here, the majority of VOCs are produced during the fermentation phase, just like making beer or wine or so. That's when you produce during the fermentation phase. That's when you convert sugars into things like alcohols. So the same thing happens in the silage pile. So now the compounds are produced, and they are now contained in the silage particles. And if the silage particles are in close contact, then these VOCs stay in there. But sooner or later, you will take those particles apart from one another. That can happen either during the storage phase if you don't compact well, or at the very latest, it occurs once you put it in front of the cows, right? That's when this always happens. So we always get to this point here at the very latest when the feed is put in front of the cows. And so the question then arises, how can we get this material to the cows in a way that's least disturbed as possible? And or what do we need to do to the particles to bind the compounds to stay in there, such as water inclusion? So mainly we need to think about frequency of feeding. Those dairies that feed once a day might want to think about, hey, what would it take me to feed more often? Or If they don't add water, maybe they should. I cannot give you ultimate recommendations today, okay? Because this research is still, even though it's very applied, it's still research at a very early stage. Okay, I want to really emphasize that. That's not the end all of all silage research here. But it is an important insight as what the most important processes are that we need to focus on more. The second part of your question, I forgot, I'm sorry.
It was, how do you explain that very large difference between the open feeding and then even the open barn compared to the...
Yes, so the two most important drivers of VOC emissions on dairies are temperature and velocity. When you have an open lot where wind can basically go through and is undisturbed, then you have maximum losses affected by the driver velocity, wind velocity. When you have a barn, even though they are open side-walled barns, you have all different kinds of obstacles, whether it's concrete dividers or whether it's freestall beds or whatever it might be. So there's a different turbulency inside a freestall barn compared to a dry lot corral, let's say. And as a result, there are lower emissions. So there's less velocity impact. And there's less radiation on that feed because the freestall barn has a roof. And that means there's no direct sunlight on that feed. Whereas an open dry lot corral has feed that might be exposed to the sun. And so as a result, not just the velocity, but also the temperature of that feed is different. And again, these two have been shown by our research to be the main drivers. Does that answer your question?
Hi, my name is JP Cataviella with Dairy Cares. Thank you, Dr. Mittlerner, for a very excellent presentation and a balanced kind of approach to looking at this issue. I think your presentation rightly focuses on VOCs, and I think 90% of the discussion today really, to me, is very helpful to understanding the VOC issue. I wanted to make one comment along the lines of VOCs and then switch a little bit to the NOx discussion, which I also appreciated and was hoping to clarify a few points. One of them is on the mixing, adding moisture during mixing. I just want to point out, and I appreciate that you said, we're at a very early stage here, that, in our minds, there's not a lot of room for adjusting moisture in the mix. You have to have some for palatability. You get too much and then the cows won't eat the feed. So there's not a lot of room there to adjust, but we do agree that moisture is helpful for both palatability of the feed and for reducing VOCs. Switching to NOx, as you pointed out, it's no news that NOx from silos is a local exposure issue. I think there's between 1 and 2 dozen deaths in the United States every year from exposure to silo gas, mostly from grain, but also from silage. And I think actually in California, this is almost a non-existent problem because of the style of silos that we use. People don't enter silos generally on dairies. They're much as you described. So I think the exposure that your researchers experienced was an unfortunate necessity of trying to measure the silage, but they were doing an activity that a dairy would not do. Once the dairy closes that pile, it stays closed until the NOx production phase is over. And if there's any NOx left in the pile, it's what wasn't able to leak out during that course. But I don't think there's a terrible problem with NOx exposure at the local level. I appreciate that you mentioned that this really isn't an issue on the regional scale. I am a little concerned, and this not necessarily pointing the finger at you, but you know, the announcement for this workshop said that quote, dairy silage has been identified as a significant source of volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides, both of which are ozone precursors, and this may contribute to extreme non-attainment, ozone extreme non-attainment in the San Joaquin Valley. And I'm concerned that language like that puts the NOx emissions on par with the VOC emissions. I didn't see in your work any actual measurement of total NOx produced. I wonder, for one thing, could you comment briefly on, given that you couldn't measure the NOx, what are we talking about, 3 orders of magnitude or less than the VOCs? I think it's very important to kind of put to bed the idea, you know, that this NOx is and again, you did in your presentation, but I think folks saw the announcement for this webinar and thought, well, silage is an important source of NOx and ozone emissions. So I don't know if you have any comments along those lines.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thank you for your comments. On the NOx side, as I alluded to before, the NOx are an issue within the first few days of ensiling. And that's really as long as there's any oxygen in there, in the pile, any residual oxygen. That's the time when you have CO2 production and NOx production. The NOx is actually stemming from the original, the origin of that nitrogen in the NOx is the nitrate in the fertilizer that went into the crops. So the more nitrate that goes onto the crops, let's say the corn, the more nitrate in the fertilizer, the more NOx in the initial stages of ensiling. That's just an interesting little side comment. The NOx is produced the first 5 days or so. And even though we don't have bunkers, we do have a situation where, for example, a silage bag in the first few days of ensiling will expand, and that's because the gases such as CO2 and also NOx are kind of pushing. And in many cases, those gases have to be relieved. And that's done through a hole in there. And then the gases go off, and that's it. As I said, the majority of that gas is CO2. During that time, the person who does that practice should not. You know, if that person sees brown gas or yellow gas, that person should go, you know, the opposite direction fast. This is an issue of exposure. It's not an issue of major regional ozone formation, in my opinion. At least our data has not shown that. But as I said, I will not exaggerate the impact of that research and or the ramifications, because obviously we have not looked into regional airshed issues with respect to formation of ozone. You know, we have looked at a mitigation study here, looked at different practices and how they affect the most important gases. So I have no reason to believe from what we have looked at that there are major contributions of piles on NOx. There are those that I have alluded to, and other than an exposure risk, I have nothing to suggest that there are some even close comparisons between VOC and NOx emissions. I cannot tell you how many orders of magnitude there lie between these two. I don't know that. But the focus with respect to ozone formation and silage should clearly be on VOCs.
I appreciate that. Just as a follow-up to that, I would say that I think it would behoove us all to be careful about using the word significant, because, you know, significant can mean many different things depending on the context. You know, it could mean anything from measurable to you know, this is a major contributor, and I'm putting VOC and NOx on par with each other, as a significant source.
Yeah,
of
I use the
disservice
term in one way only, and that is when it comes to statistics, because significant is an important term to be used to show differences, statistical differences. When they are statistically different, then they are significant. Some people have a different use of that term, but that's not mine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. If not, thank you, Dr. Mitterlohner, for the presentation, and thank you, everybody in the audience. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for coming, and thanks for your interest. Appreciate that.